We'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia with Politics and Prose. We're live with Isaac Stone-Fish and John Pomfret discussing America Second, how America's elites are making China stronger. You'll find a link in the chat column to purchase your copy of the book directly from Politics and Prose. If you have questions during this hour, go ahead and put those in the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. We'll move to questions in the last portion of the discussion, though we apologize if we run short on time to answer all of them. Additionally, we're glad to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. If you'd like to enable captions, click the CC live transcript icon at the bottom of your screen. And we do want to thank all of you out there for being with us this evening. We are very grateful to our family of loyal customers who keep our business and our spirits afloat. Now to this great new book published today. In America Second, Isaac Stone-Fish traces the evolution of the party's influence in America. He shows how America's leaders initially welcomed China's entry into the US economy, believing that trade and engagement would lead to a more democratic China. He explains how, although this belief has proved misguided, many of our business-minded and politicians have become too dependent on China to challenge it. Author Isaac Stone-Fish is the founder and CEO of the research firm Strategy Risks, which quantifies corporate exposure to China. He's also a Washington Post Global Opinions contributing columnist, a contributor to CBSN, an adjunct at NYU's Center for Global Affairs, a visiting fellow at the Atlantic Council, a columnist on China risk at Barron's, and a frequent speaker at events around the United States and the world. He's a fluent Mandarin speaker and formerly a Beijing correspondent for Newsweek, and spent 6 years living in China. He currently lives in New York. And joining us from the West Coast is John Pomfret, award-winning journalist who worked with the Washington Post for decades. Pomfret was a foreign correspondent for 20 years and spent 8 of those years covering big wars and small in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Congo, Sri Lanka, and Iraq. Pomfret spent 7 years covering China, one in the late 1980s during the Tiananmen Square protests, and then from 1997 until the end of 2003 as the bureau chief for the Washington Post in Beijing. Pomfret ran the Post's Outlook section and covered US relations with Asia. He's the author of several best-selling titles, most recently From Warsaw with Love. Enough from me this evening. On behalf of Politics and Prose, please join me in welcoming author Isaac Stone-Fish and John Pomfret. Thank you both. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Julia. Hello, everybody. It's great that Politics and Prose is putting on this event for this extremely important book. I thought it was actually a really great read and also a really courageous book. Isaac is really taking on many of the powers that be in Washington who've benefited mightily from the United States' relations with China. So Isaac, my first question to you is, why this book now?
Thank you, John. And the reason now is because it took a really long time to write. I think if I had been able to finish it earlier, get it out earlier, I think I would love to have it come out 2-3 years ago. But it was just a very long process, a very arduous fact-checking process. And I think I'm heartened to see where both the Trump and the Biden administration have taken some of these policies, and discouraged to see where Hollywood and Wall Street remain as it relates to China.
So you lay some pretty serious charges at the feet of Henry Kissinger. So much so that actually a spokesman for Kissinger you've quoted in the book is calling some of your charges libelous. Can you walk us briefly through Kissinger's, let's say, missteps when it comes to China? And what was the import of those missteps? What was the consequences from his behavior?
So Kissinger, while he was in office in the 1970s, was a statesman. And in 1982, after he founded Kissinger Associates, his business and consulting company, he was a business person, often masquerading as a statesman. And the issue with Kissinger is that he amplified positive voices of China, suppressed negative voices of China, and made it seem like he was advocating for the interests of the US government and the US people, when in a lot of ways he was advocating for the interests of China, the Chinese Communist Party, and Kissinger himself. Oops, I think my other sound is, yes, 1 second there.
I'll come back on momentarily as we wait for the author to reconnect. To our audience out there, this time in Zoom definitely brings about these types of moments. I'll go ahead and reiterate to our audience members out there, if you have any questions this evening, put those in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I'll just wait for the author to reconnect. There we go.
Is this the right way up, or is this sideways?
Pivoting 90 degrees to the right would be great.
All right, let us get this tilted.
There we go. Oh, almost.
All right.
Oh,
Perfect.
excellent.
All right. Let's try that again.
So, Isaac, how did Kissinger's, self-dealing, if you will, how do you think that affected the course? Did it affect U.S. policy at all?
I think it very much did. And I think what happened was Kissinger was so politically influential for both Republicans and Democrats, and he was very able to shape US policy towards China, arguably more than anyone else outside of the White House in every administration, with the exception of Reagan and probably Obama too. Kissinger encouraged Newt Gingrich to not recognize Taiwan when Gingrich was speaker. He probably spent more time talking to Cheney than anyone outside of the White House. He was the one who convinced Trump not to meet with the Dalai Lama, breaking decades of US precedent on that. And he did it because he had this reputation as such a brilliant China watcher and such a grand intelligence of realpolitik, and people believed it.
And so while he's doing this, he's also making serious coin. Do you have any estimate of the amount of money he made off his business deals in China?
I don't. Sometimes they'd get reported. I think a former colleague of ours, John Garneau, was able to put a $5 million price tag on what Rio Tinto paid Kissinger for his advice in China. He's worked with many of the major multinationals. The numbers used to be a lot more public. People in the 80s, when he was just starting out, the people who worked at Kissinger Associates were a lot more comfortable talking about it, but then he got so much bad press for being shilling, as some would say, for these regimes, that they stopped being open about it. But I think it'd be fair to estimate that he earned probably tens of millions of dollars helping US companies doing business in China over several decades.
Wow, that's a lot of money. So Kissinger isn't the only one to be targeted, if you will, by your book. There's also the Bush family. Could you go into a little bit of a taxonomy about how they profited off their relationship with China?
So it's funny, for all the controversy of George W. Bush as president, he's been an ideal ex-president when it comes to business in China. Same thing for Richard Nixon, who, for all of the deserved controversies of his presidency, was quite upright as an ex-president. George H.W. Bush was not. George H.W. Bush, soon after leaving office, followed in Gerald Ford's footsteps and served as a consultant. But while Ford focused mostly on domestic businesses, H.W. Bush focused very internationally in Kuwait, in Saudi, in Canada, and arguably especially in China, where he was a rival to Kissinger in terms of opening doors for US businesses. And one industry that focused specifically on both of those men was insurance. So it needed very high level regulatory approval. And the head of AIG, Maurice Greenberg, had Kissinger on an advisory board. Kissinger would often bring Greenberg when he went to meet with Deng Xiaoping and other Chinese leaders. And for Bush, it was Chubb Insurance and other firms that would bring Bush. He would open the doors for them, and they would get the meetings and eventually get their licenses. And what happened was Chinese leaders and Chinese propaganda outlets would understand that, oh, well, we can point to the difference between Bush Sr. and Bush Jr. and how they talk about China to make what Bush Jr. does look misguided. Bush Sr. goes to China, talks about, like he did during the Olympics, we should give China credit for how far they've come, doesn't criticize China, is far more praiseworthy of the country than he was when he was president. And they do that to say, well, listen, look at Bush Jr., look what he's doing, and look how problematic that is. I spend a decent amount of time in the book talking about Neil Bush, the son of H.W. and the brother of W. And it's frustrating to see all the attention paid to Hunter Biden and all of what he's done when Neil Bush is what the Republicans want Hunter Biden to be. There's so much evidence out there of all sorts of business that Neil did when his brother was president and afterwards. And his family is, well, I want to say out of politics, certainly less in the political spotlight than they were before, but Neil is very active in this space, and I think a lot more deserves to be written about him.
And your sort of one of your main theses is that this type of business activity also affected how America saw China and affected America's policy towards China. Can you sort of draw some of the links for us to understand how Neil Bush or H.W. Bush making serious money in China has had an effect on our policy towards Beijing?
Sometimes it's from the business community, and sometimes it's their influence in the policy community. When someone leaves office, they don't immediately lose all their policy relevance. They advise the current president, they advise senators, they have a lot of friends who are still in the White House, who are still in the administration. And people ask them about China. Bush would go, he would meet with Chinese leaders, and then he would brief current leaders, he'd brief his current aides about what he saw. And these people serve on corporate boards, they get asked for their advice. How should we do this? What should we say? What shouldn't we say? And in some ways, it's healthy. It's a way for information to circulate between two countries. But in other ways, it's most pernicious when these people would speak about these issues publicly or give advice that would ensure that they would continue to have those meetings.
Right. And as you noticed, actually, China is very cognizant of this problem, so much so that it won't allow ex-Politburo and ex-high-ranking Chinese officials to leave China, right? Yeah.
And I'd love to see a lot more US regulation on former leaders, former senators, former secretaries, certainly not nearly at that level that China has. But I think following some US laws, tightening up what's called the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA, or the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, could help to close some of these big loopholes.
Right. Yeah. So in your book, you lay out three choices for dealing with China. Can you, and basically three options that the United States has facing this kind of rising power in Asia. What are they, and where do you stand on them?
The first is to yield. The UK basically yielded to US dominance fairly peacefully. And that's what Beijing would like to see. They'd like to see the US become second. Rarely do they state it that way. It'd be far less effective of a message if they did. The second is to push against some of the negatives of China's rise, try to remove the influence of the PLA and the Communist Party in the United States, strengthen institutions at home, and hope for the best with China. And then the third is to actively push to weaken the Communist Party, potentially to push for regime change, to push for new leadership. What Chinese officials would love to talk about is reform. But I think in this case would really mean something a lot more drastic. And I'm so mixed. I certainly don't support the first idea, though I do have to say if China becomes a democratic, healthy polity, I'd be far more comfortable with that. Largest country in the world, successful economy. I could see that working out well, both for China and the globe. And the second strategy feels like it'll probably just lead to the third strategy. It's a way of buying time. I don't want to advocate for regime change probably anywhere. I mean, even North Korea, which is far more shambolic of a polity than China, but if Kim Jong-un falls soon, it's impossible to say whether who will replace him will be better or worse. But I do feel like the Communist Party poses a near existential threat to the global order, and that where we are as a country is in sore need of a very honest debate about what should be done, what are the costs, and are they worth it?
It's a tough question. So in one part of your book, you talk a little bit about Gary Locke, who was a former governor of Washington State and the Secretary of Commerce. And Locke's interesting because he's a Chinese American. And I'm using his example of somebody who has sort of profited in a way from his relationship with China. At the same time, he's also a Chinese American. And it gets to the question of, how do you construct a policy dealing with China that can avoid some of the name calling and racism and the McCarthyism that the United States faced in the 1950s? I mean, the Trump administration and also the Biden administration have been criticized by Asian American community, specifically the Chinese American community, for actively targeting, for example, Chinese Americans or ethnic Chinese scientists in this country for an espionage as well. So I'm curious, how do you square that circle of constructing a viable U.S.-China relationship that is tough on Beijing without turning around and encouraging racism back in our own country?
I think that's a great question. And I think I'm glad to see the Justice Department reorienting what it used to call its China initiative. And I think it's going to start focusing far less on Chinese and Chinese Americans. When I was finishing the book, I spoke to Jack Chen, who's a professor at Rutgers at the time, I believe. And Alan Dershowitz had just been making some crazy comments about Trump. And he said, well, no one sees Dershowitz as an Israeli spy. They just think he's a fool. And paraphrasing there what Jack said. And I think that would be a good place for Chinese Americans to be and to get. And I think one of the reasons I very intentionally focused on people like Kissinger and Schwartzman and Bob Iger and Madeleine Albright is that I do see most of the problem with the US and China in the United States as coming from non-Chinese, as coming from mostly white Americans who have held power here. I think it's going to be a very difficult balance to strike, but I do feel like for ethical and strategic reasons, the US needs to treat Chinese Americans like any other Americans. I think that's a very important lesson. And I think if there's a massacre against Asian Americans in this country, I think if there are more atrocities, you're going to lose a lot of people who would otherwise want a stronger support for policies that push back against Beijing. And so I think for folks who do want to see real changes and who do want to see a really heavy push against Beijing, understanding that you'll have a far more receptive policy environment in the United States the further that this is disconnected from anything racially based.
Now you mentioned Bob Iger, which brings to mind the whole Hollywood issue. And one of the fascinating things about your book actually is you don't simply bash Hollywood for being pro-Beijing. You also draw a contrast between Hollywood and television. And basically looking at television actually as a bastion of sort of free thinking, whereas Hollywood seems to be almost captive of the China market. Can you talk about how TV and Hollywood have sort of split in a way, they bifurcated in a way in terms of their views of China and their portrayals of China to the average American viewer?
It's very surprising to me to watch shows like Veep or House of Cards or The Last Ship and see, I don't want to say a realistic portrayal of China because they're satires or they're extreme drama, but a far more realistic portrayal than we see in Hollywood sanitized portrayals of China. And I spent a lot of time watching these TV shows and watching these films and trying to figure out where it came from. And it seemed to be a couple of different things. One is that television, just broadly speaking, doesn't travel as well as film does. It's a lot more news, it's a lot more humor, it's a lot more, game shows or reality shows, which other countries will just remake. So there's less of a market justification. Rupert Murdoch failed very famously in China in the early 2000s. That sent a negative signal to other folks in the TV space trying to expand there. And TV never had its annus horribilis of 1997 when three films came out, 7 Years in Tibet, Kundun, and Red Corner, that were all critical of the party. And Beijing responded by banning Disney. And Disney decided that the lesson they were going to learn from this is not, well, we don't need the Chinese market, which at that time had a box office of $17 million, roughly the size of Peru, but rather we will apologize and we will do what it takes to get our 1 billion customers. And so I think Disney's really been leading the charge there.
Interesting points. There's been some very interesting economic research over the last few years that basically have concluded that a significant, like upwards of hundreds of thousands, even more than that, manufacturing jobs were lost as China rose and America basically outsourced its manufacturing capabilities to the Far East and to China in particular. In your book, is there any kind of look at that issue and how these elites in the United States have benefited from globalization and in basically ignoring this huge percentage of America's working class who saw significant, now automation obviously played a huge role in this, but China did as well. And it seemed like for years, this was a topic that was basically not discussed. And is it your sense that Americans' elite has basically kind of tried to sweep this problem under the table by embracing globalization, or is it a more complicated story?
I think it's a more complicated story. I mean, I think it's a difficult thing when you have, so let's say trade with China adds $10 to every American. So that's that would be about $3 billion. But it means that, 1,000 Americans lose, $5,000. Those 1,000 Americans are going to be much more upset than the Americans gaining $10, but they'll lose a lot less holistically. And I think the issue is that US policy hasn't addressed widening wealth gaps and loss of opportunities in a lot of places. And I still do believe, with a much heavier national security bent than I did before, in relatively free trade. And I think for that, it's that a lot of it is US tax code, US healthcare, other things that really need to be fixed. I think most of the book, I don't fully support the idea of, oh yeah, the problems are domestic and we'll solve those and then we can just ignore China. But I do feel like in the inequality question, fixing the tax code, which is intensely complicated, and fixing health insurance, which is of course also intensely complicated, are better solutions than cracking down on free trade.
Right. Now, in your book, you also talk about yourself and some of the moral kind of compromises you've had to make in your own work on China. And you look at self-censorship as an example. Can you talk about that a bit? I thought that was one of the surprising parts of the book for me. Yeah.
I think when I started getting into journalism, you learn about, what are the things you can say, what can't you say, what are the rules, tianguizi, they call them in Chinese, sort of hidden rules about the industry. And I realized that there was a lot of those specifically with China, and then you would extrapolate based on the environment that you were in. And then I realized that a lot of the things that I started criticizing other people for doing, I had done myself. And it just didn't seem fair to be, only critical and not take a very critical lens at myself and the failings that I've made. There's plenty of times that I self-censor. There's plenty of times when I've inadvertently repeated Chinese propaganda. There's plenty of times when I didn't criticize someone because I wanted them to like me, or I wanted to work with them in the future, or I thought it would offend them. And so often when I was interviewing, especially academics, about self-censorship, they'd say, "Oh, well, this isn't self-censorship. I just don't want to offend him." But that's the definition of self-censorship: to not say or do something because you're afraid of hurting or offending someone. So I realized that I had done the same thing and thought it would be a more effective way of communicating about it if I were honest with my own shortcomings.
Yeah, I discovered when I was in Beijing working as a reporter, one of the best ways to bond with middle-aged Chinese men was to bash Japan. Even though Japan is a great country and people are wonderful, but it's a very typical technique one can use in order to bond with your Chinese interlocutor. So to the problem of self-dealing former American officials, how would you deal with that issue vis-a-vis China? Is it something that really has to be done across the board in terms of sort of ethics legislation? Should these people be outed on a more regular basis? I mean, one of the fascinating things I found in your book is that when you ask these people who are, clearly making a significant amount of money on the back of a China business or advising American companies in China, they all seem to be shocked that you could conclude that perhaps, their China business was influencing the way that they thought and the way that they portrayed China and their attempts to influence American foreign policy. How would you deal with that?
I think part of it is the public spotlight. I think part of it is registration. Our lobbying registration rules are so watered down. To be a lobbyist, I think you have to spend at least 20% of your time lobbying. So many people will lobby, not register as a lobbyist, and say, "Oh yeah, I just do this, do this 8 hours a week, and I work 50 hours a week, so I'm not a lobbyist." And it wouldn't be that hard to call for more both transparency and more regulation. I think also, to give some folks the benefit of the doubt, until 2016, U.S. policy was, let's strengthen China. We want a healthy and strong China. And how do you strengthen China? You go and work with the Communist Party. You go work for the Communist Party. And so many U.S. business leaders have honorary chairmanships of advisory boards, are fellows at universities, which are all state-owned, are advisors to city governments. I'm not going to say his name because I don't want to get the wrong one. I can't remember which tycoon is an official advisor to the Beijing city government, which, when you think about it, is absolutely crazy. It's, that's what you do. That's part of your role. And so I think letting people be aware of that, letting them understand also, you don't have to do that. It's not the way it has to be. Tesla, you don't have to open a showroom in the capital of Xinjiang on New Year's Eve. You can still succeed in China and come out with your ethics mostly intact.
Yeah, what's your analysis of that decision by Tesla to open up literally a Tesla showroom just several days after the United States passed the act to prevent the importation of forced labor products from Xinjiang into the United States? Was it a disconnect, or do you think was it actually a very conscious decision to show China that they were loyal somehow?
I have no idea to what degree Musk manages or micromanages what happens in China with Tesla, and how intentional it was, if it was supposed to be another time, or if there was a lot of pushback internally and they felt like they had to do it. But if it were an intentional decision, Musk is one of the most effective Twitter trolls there is, and it's hard not to see this as a trolling move. It was just such a galling thing to do. The timing was so egregious. It was almost as bad as doing it on Inauguration Day or doing it on July 4th. It was pretty galling.
Right. So for years, I remember in engaging with policymakers and then ex-policymakers, so people who have been in the government and were out of the government, but still involved in the China trade. The narrative was that we needed to do X, Y, or Z in China because waiting in the wings, there were a group of people in China who were reform-minded, who needed our support. And if only we would do X, Y, and Z, that would appeal to the reformists, and it would help strengthen the reformists, then we would ultimately get a reform-minded China. That seems to have been sort of a significant chestnut that was held by many people who were doing business in China, because their narrative was that we're here because we're helping China to reform. Is that something that strikes a chord with you? And if so, do you think these people actually believed this? Or do you think that was the line that they were selling Americans in order to justify making a significant amount of money in China?
Beijing is so effective at finding people that it terms as friends who are the only ones who have a sophisticated enough understanding of the great, intense, wonderful history of the great Chinese nation. And only they can fully understand that, yes, actually, there are reform-minded people who want to move closer to the United States, but it's just that the U.S. is so anti-China because people don't really understand how China has always lived in peace. And there are these lines, these patterns that you hear over and over again. China has 5,000 years of history. China's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. That are repetitions of Chinese propaganda. And I do wonder a lot, do people actually believe these things? Does Kissinger actually believe the things he says about China? And I really don't know. And I really don't know if it's better or worse if they were to believe it, or if they don't, if they're just doing it in a cynical way.
But in your book, at one point, you're interviewing a former US ambassador to China, and you ask him whether he ever believed that America's policy in China would ultimately help reform China and turn China in a more liberal direction. And his response is, no, I never believed that. But Americans have been sold this idea, from Clinton to Bob Rubin to George W. Bush to Condoleezza Rice, that if China entered the WTO, if China got most favored nation trading status, it would ultimately become a more liberal society. But at the same time, you have this senior American official saying, well, we never believed that. So do you think that Americans were sold a bill of goods by the American elite? Or do you think that some people believed it and some people didn't? And, 6 of one, half dozen of the other?
It's such a good question. So that this former ambassador, State Roy, said that everyone worked on policy knew it was just to sell the policy. They didn't actually believe it. They just thought it was a palatable way to sell it. And Condoleezza Rice said that trade brings liberalization. It's an iron law. And gosh, I really don't know. I mean, I think it's so hard to know if people did actually believe it. Would they admit it? It was, in the words of someone I interviewed, in the air that you breathe, and doing well by doing good. That this is the way. We're doing God's work in China, and we're making a buck too. And what could be better? And there were skeptics, or there are people who later claimed to be skeptics, but it was the conventional wisdom, and conventional wisdom can be hard to push against.
Right. So in your book, you seem to be, in terms of those three policies that you laid out, one is sort of making way for China. The second is, pushing back, and then finally the third is some type of regime change. It's interesting that Biden released in the last couple of days his Indo-Pacific strategy, in which he solidly puts himself in the second basket. He basically says, we're done with trying to shape China. We're just trying to focus on what's in the interest of the United States. Have you taken a look at the new national security statement, and what is your sense? Do you think it's basically the next step will be basket number 3, and we're going to be involved in full force global competition with China? Or do you think it's going to be somewhere in the middle and we'll be able to compete and cooperate as the situation develops?
I think we're already in something closer to 3. And I think US policymakers, either because they feel like it's not politic or because they don't fully understand it, aren't explicitly admitting that. I mean, I think we see it a lot more from Congress than we do from the White House. People saying like, this is where we are today. And I found the strategy a bit wanting in terms of specifics about what we're doing. And I feel, I get frustrated because people will say, well, we can't change China, but we shouldn't say this because it's going to embarrass them. and you can't, both those things can't be true at the same time. If your words have an influence over China, then you can change them. And I do feel like it's obviously a lot more nuanced than that, but I do feel like we have levers to push on, and a lot of them we're starting to push on, I think, in a very healthy way. And there's a lot more that we should push on.
Right. Now back to the idea, this whole, your concern about sort of a new McCarthyism. How would you help Americans think about this problem without kind of basically inflaming anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism in the United States? And do you think that that's already happened because of Trump and because of the China initiative? And what steps can you take to try to limit that, at the same time being cognizant of the fact that the significant amount of espionage is happening in this country in universities and other things and other organizations around the nation?
I think they come from two different areas, and I think it's useful to separate the racism and the McCarthyism. The sort of, oh, you're an advocate for party policies, you're a communist, therefore you should be fired, or you're Chinese, you're a spy, that piece of it. I think, we talked a little bit about the second one already, and I think separating the party and the people and being very explicit, the issue is with the party and is not with Chinese people. George W. Bush did an excellent job right after 9/11, praising the Muslim faith and making it explicitly clear that the U.S. problems were with Al-Qaeda and were not with Arabs and were not with Muslims. And there's a lot of problems to what he did afterwards, but he did that right after 9/11 in a way that I thought was very, very healthy and very, very helpful. And Trump obviously hasn't done anything like that. And Biden perhaps hasn't needed to, but would like to see him be more explicit on on our problem being with the Chinese Communist Party than with Chinese people. I think, frankly, the McCarthyist problem, it's gotten a lot less attention. It might even be more difficult because we want America to remain a place of raucous debate. And if someone wants to join the Communist Party, fantastic. If someone wants to advocate for these policies, fantastic. And I think the issue is with the corruption as opposed to with the freedom of speech, freedom of organization, freedom to believe. So I think if you're a former Secretary of State who's lobbying for closer ties with China and is making a lot of money while you're doing so, you should be forced to register, and there should be laws restricting you because of the powerful platform that you have, because of your likely ability to go back, have clearance, be inside the government, have classified information. But I think that's very different than the think tank analyst or the official who says, yeah, I'm a communist, this is what I believe.
Right. Now, do you see the current state of US-China relations to be one that's going to be making it more difficult for people like this to be involved in self-dealing because of the scrutiny and the increasing lack of mistrust, the lack of trust on the American side vis-a-vis China? I mean, as you noted in your book, Americans have basically are at a low point in their views of China, according to every poll you look at. 67%, I think, in the most recent poll had negative views of China. So is that making kind of this coterie of these people who've benefited so much from the US-China relations, is that shrinking them, putting more of a spotlight on them? How do you see it playing out in the future?
I hope so. I hope it goes in that direction, but I do also worry about general US policy chaos. And Trump famously came in saying he was going to drain the swamp. Trump famously brought a lot more corruption into Washington. And I do worry that if it's done haphazardly or if it's done from a very irresponsible leader, then it won't solve that. I'm cautiously optimistic about where Biden is and where he's going on these things. But I think a lot depends on that macro context.
And back to the macro context, then the question is, people talk about decoupling, right? And Americans have become so accustomed to being surrounded by everything which is made in China. And decoupling means that a significant portion of that stuff is not going to be around anymore. how do you, I mean, people say that it's impossible. We can't decouple from China. We're so deeply intertwined in their supply chain, and they're intertwined in ours. Do you think that it's possible to begin to pull apart a relationship that's been built over time, hundreds and thousands, in fact, millions of man hours used to bind these two countries together? Do you think it's possible to pull it apart at all? Or do
Oh,
you
of
think,
course.
yeah,
100%. I mean, so many things that were impossible happened. And, I mean, 2 years ago, oh yeah, all of the restaurants are going to be closed. No, that's not possible. Just closing all the restaurants. Oh, they did that. Oh, World War II, that was impossible before it happened, and then it happened. I think I mean, I don't know if I can fully say when the US and China go to war, but if they go to war, and if it's a long, drawn out war, whether over Taiwan or over other US interests in Asia, if it's a big war, there will be wholesale decoupling. And, I mean, the US had bread lines in the 30s. There were shortages in the UK. I mean, far worse things happened in Central and Eastern Europe. And I mean, it's not something that I hope happens, but all of these things are very, very possible.
right. And decoupling with China is probably the easiest of them all, right? So we're going to go to the audience a little bit for some questions. Interesting question. What type of lifestyle changes would Americans have to accept in order to stop depending so heavily on China and its exports?
I think it would be, it's funny, we're going through some of those now, in part because of the pandemic, in part because we're less, less supportive of China, delays in supply chains, raising of prices. I think, some of them are going to be things that we'll know by their absence. So, for folks who really like TikTok, you can imagine not having TikTok or having never had TikTok. I think it'll be things like that. So it'll be, how important is that for your quality of life? How important is it for, for there to be higher inflation, or for, tires or various goods to cost 20% more? I think those will be the most noticeable signs.
So it's an inflationary issue from your perspective then?
Inflationary, perhaps further delays, lack of certain goods, less collaboration opportunities. But I mean, I think it's important to remember that so much of this has been happening anyway, with China being so closed because of COVID. So I think, I mean, I don't know if I want to put it this way, but we are kind of getting used to them being removed from the US because they've shut themselves off so completely.
Right. Does that benefit China?
It benefits the party because it trains people to be more fearful, more under party control, much less used to the outside world, degrades the quality of the information they get. But I'd say it hurts China.
Right. So there's an important distinction to be made then. Right. So we now have Russia teetering on its invasion of Ukraine. And my question is, how do you think this crisis in Eastern Europe is going to impact US-China relations? It's somewhat almost reminiscent of the cascading crises we faced in the Middle East, which have often pulled America's eyes off the ball when it comes to our policy in Asia. Are we facing another round of this type of stuff as well? And the Biden administration, which came into office wanting to focus on China, has to basically refocus itself on Europe.
So far, I've been impressed by the self-control to not get involved with this crisis to the level that would prove a major distraction. Part of that is Republican pushback. Part of that is the understanding that US interests in Ukraine are not nearly as rich as they are in Asia and over Taiwan. And I think part of it is, we got out of Afghanistan in part to focus on China. And I think the Biden administration, and perhaps this is giving them too much credit, but perhaps they saw what happened with Bush and 9/11 and what a terrible move a lot of that was in hindsight, where China was the long-term issue and they focused on all of these short-term issues. So I'm hoping that that's animating what Biden is doing, but perhaps it's just policy paralysis.
That's interesting. So another question from the audience, from your perspective, a lot of, and as you've reported in your book, there are some American companies and American ex-officials who've sort of gone to the dark side, if you will, and have basically sort of carried China's water for them. But do you have examples of Americans and both either companies or individuals who've not carried the water, who've been kind of true to their ethics, if you will, but at the same time pursued business opportunities in China without having to kind of sully themselves in getting into bed with the party?
No, but there are ex-American officials who have not done business in China in a very upright way. And, again, perhaps these people are out there and I just haven't seen them or focused on them. But I was quite impressed with Nixon's, after the way Nixon handled China after his presidency. He was still critical. He would still go and meet. He would bring policy aides when he went to China. Kissinger would bring business associates when he went to China. A very big difference. Kissinger was going, he'd bring Greenberg, he'd bring Judith Hope, who was another board member. Whereas Nixon would bring people that he worked with who were China experts. And Jimmy Carter acts and speaks about Beijing in ways that I strongly disagree with, but I applaud the work that he's done globally and his refusal to get rich from being a US president. And I think he's a very good example of someone who, perhaps has become, more pro-party than he expected to, but, is doing so for very good reasons.
Right. He believes in it. He's not making any money. Right. So you've lived in China for many years. People often talk about the rise of Chinese nationalism as being a significant threat to stability around the world because you have lots of very engaged Chinese citizens interested in pushing China's narrative and its military forces around the globe. Do you think that the Chinese nationalism is a real threat? And is it your perspective that the Chinese are, quote unquote, more united than us fractious Americans? Or is that just a narrative that the party-owned media wants you to believe?
Gosh, it's such a good question. I mean, I do worry about the Chinese hatred of the Japanese. And one thing that worries me about the potential for China to democratize is be very, very popular for a new Chinese leader to ride that sentiment to an invasion of Japan or a bombing of Japan or a war with Japan. And I think nationalism is a somewhat icky force wherever it is in the world. And I don't know. I mean, I think that there are so many distinct individual identities in China that the party is so tried to snuff out. Mao Zedong, before he discovered communism, flirted with the idea of having a Hunan independence movement, the province that he was in. I think I read about that in your book, John. And I think there's all sorts of different identities that could be allowed to flourish in a healthier local way as opposed to a national way. Hong Kong, Guangdong, the Northeast, Xinjiang, Tibet. But I do feel like nationalism is one way that angry youth, as they used to call them, can express their anger. And so in that case, it does worry me.
And you also see the creation of this almost monoculture now in China, whereas even Chairman Mao glorified the many different minorities in China, but now you see the current government really focusing on a very Han-centric idea and wanting to dilute both genetically and culturally the people of Xinjiang in a sea of Han Chinese as well. So that causes concerns. I'm curious about, this is something that happened after your book came out, but I think it kind of probably relates to it directly. So the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act passed in Washington in December. But over the last year, American companies were lobbying very vociferously against the act because they didn't really want to face it. What do you think all that was about? Was it just purely about money? Was it about carrying China's water? How would you, as taking the perspective that you took in writing your book, how would you kind of unpack that for us? So we have Nike, we have Apple, we have all these major American corporations lobbying very much against that act. But forced labor is forced labor. Why would they try to be avoiding reporting issues about that as well? So I'm curious
I think,
how you see that.
yeah, and this is speculation, but I think it's a combination of both. I think it's a combination of, oh, if we have to disclose these things, it'll be both embarrassing and could lead for us to have to restrict our business in China. And I think probably what happened is that Chinese officials made it clear to government affairs people in these companies that, hey, this act is anti-China. It's bad for US businesses in China. There will be reprisals, said delicately, said with hints, said through different channels, that if they don't do this, their business could suffer. And I think they took that into account and said, well, yeah, we know we'll probably get hit in the United States. We'll take a PR dent if we do this, but it's better than the alternative. And right now, there's a process. There's 180 days for companies to basically negotiate with the US government over the stipulations of this act. And I really hope it doesn't get all that watered down. And I worry after these things get passed, they get a lot of attention. But then it's the lobbyists and the companies that go in and spend a lot of time on changing the act so that it's not as strong or as forthright as it should be. So I hope that's not happening in this case. A lot of it's private and will be until it comes out.
Right. Yeah. So what is your take on Chinese apps and technologies? There's a lot of talk about these are real significant cybersecurity threats, but there's other people saying, well, really not so much. I mean, what's wrong with the fact that my daughter uses TikTok on a regular basis, and even when she should be doing her AP chemistry homework? So what is your view on this?
I mean, I think the bigger worry from a parent's perspective is the distraction and the content of these apps. I mean, I think from a national security perspective, I think one of the fascinating things about emerging technology is we, or at least I, don't fully understand how this data could be used to threaten US national security. And perhaps it can't be, perhaps someone won't be able to weaponize it. But, you think about it, it feels like, throughout the last 50 or 60 years of technology, both the pornography industry and the weapons industry are among the fastest new adapters of all sorts of types of technology. And so it's very believable that the technology and the data that TikTok is gathering will have some military component. And I think that's a problem. And I think the other thing is that because the Chinese internet, because Chinese corporate systems are far less transparent, in some ways because we understand them less and we're not there, we're not reading it in Chinese, but also just the system is less transparent. There's a lot that we doubt and we worry about. And sometimes the answer is quite benign. Sometimes things are not at risk. But if you don't know, and if the system is purposefully obfuscatory, then it's probably good to suspect.
Right. So I was interested in your book that you're not one of the believers that we should shut down Confucian institutes around the United States. That was a hot topic for a while, showing sort of the thin edge of the wedge of Chinese infiltration into America. And your perspective is that it's actually not that serious a problem. Can you explain?
So you and I both started studying Chinese at a young age and learned it from a very communist perspective. I mean, I remember learning cadre and irrigation products and production brigades, I think, before I learned how to say tofu and sleep and sofa and other very basic words. But I'm really glad I had the opportunity to learn it. And although many Taiwanese will complain about how the party has bastardized the Chinese language, it's still very effective to learn how to speak like the party speaks and to be able to understand what Xi Jinping is saying. And I think in a lot of ways, Confucius institutes are far less obvious than that, far more subtle. But I do feel like they are, we have a lot bigger problems, and not learning Chinese, not being able to speak Chinese is a far bigger problem than the Confucius institutes.
Good point. Final question, just to wrap this up. You've been to China and you lived in China for many years. You haven't been there recently, but and you probably get this question a lot, but I'd like to get your take on it. What do you think Americans, what's like one of the main things Americans don't quite understand about China? Is it the system? Is it the culture? Is it the politics? What is a question that you get all over when you travel in the United States that you think I really need to like tell people about? People just don't get this thing about China.
I think I think in some ways China is far less repressive than people think. And I think people assume, oh, because the party is so repressive, therefore China feels like an open air prison. And it really doesn't. I think there's a lot more freedom around the edges. And even though things are a lot more closed than when you and I were living there, it's still more open than we think. I mean, I remember people saying like, oh, like, you were a journalist in China, weren't you afraid of getting hit by a tank? Yeah, I was never afraid that a tank was going to hit me. It never really crossed my mind. I think also people on the other side don't understand just how cruel the Communist Party is. And they'll say, oh, the so-called Chinese Communist Party, or, oh, they're not really communist. And sure, I mean, you can have a philosophical debate about, is this communist, is this Leninist, is this Stalinist? But the party is very, very clear that it is a communist party. And it does not downplay that at all in Chinese. It's very, very careful and official in its use of titles. And I think people miss that. One of my biggest pet peeves is folks calling him President Xi Jinping. If the Chinese wanted to call him president, they would, but they just call him that in English because it misleads and it makes him seem like a sort of a less threatening leader. He's chairman, or general secretary of the party. So I think there's a lot of language that folks use, but usually it's oh, either they're too critical or they're not critical enough.
Good point. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, and best of luck with your book. It's America Second, an excellent book by Isaac Stone Fish, highly recommended, and it's very courageous. So thank you for your work, Isaac.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that.
And thanks to the two of you, author Isaac Stone Fish and John Pomfret, for moderating this evening, a conversation truly between two experts. I second the recommendation to go grab a copy of America Second. You can find the link in the chat column. You can also visit us online at politics-prose.com. While you're there, feel free to check out our events calendar for everything else publishing this spring and beyond. And from our shelves to yours, everyone, we hope you're out there staying strong, staying safe, and of course, staying well read. And we will see you next time. Our thanks again, Isaac Stone.